The house had been eerily quiet for hours, the kind of silence that wrapped itself around your chest and squeezed until you couldn't quite breathe. I wasn't sure if it was because the house was too big for two people, or because it wasn't meant to hold just Ron and me for this long. Either way, the absence of my mother's voice felt like a hollow echo in every corner. Ron was in the living room, sprawled on the couch with his hand loosely holding the remote. A baseball game played on the TV, but his eyes weren't on the screen. They were distant, fixed somewhere above it, lost in thoughts I could only guess at. Mom had been gone for 3 weeks now, caring for Grandma full-time since her health had taken a turn. I knew it wasn't fair to resent my grandmother's illness, but some part of me ached every time Mom left. Not just for her, but for the weight her absence placed on Ron and me. A weight neither of us seemed to know how to carry. "Hey," I said softly as I entered the room, curling my legs under me on the opposite end of the couch. "You okay?" Ron blinked and looked at me, his expression smoothing into something easier, less burdened. He gave me a tired smile. "Yeah, kiddo. Just thinking." I hated when he called me that. Kiddo felt like a wall he built between us, as if he needed the reminder that I was Amanda, his stepdaughter, and not someone else entirely. But I didn't say anything. It wasn't worth the fight. "It's hard with her gone," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "The house doesn't feel the same." Ron nodded, shifting to sit upright. He ran a hand through his dark hair, the strands starting to silver at the edges. "Yeah, it's quieter, isn't it? Your mom brings a kind of noise I never realized I'd miss." I laughed softly, though the sound felt strange. "She'd hate to hear you call it noise." "That she would." He grinned, a genuine smile this time, and it lit up his face in a way that made my chest feel heavy. Ron wasn't handsome in a conventional way, but there was something solid and steady about him. Something that made you feel safe. Safe. That was how I was supposed to feel around him. But the longer we sat there, the more I noticed the small things. The way his shirt stretched over his shoulders, the subtle flex of his hands as he turned the remote over in his palm. And I hated myself for noticing, for feeling anything but safe. "I'll get us some tea," I blurted, needing to put distance between us. I fled to the kitchen, my bare feet padding against the cold tiles. I busied myself boiling water, my hands trembling slightly as I spooned loose leaves into the strainer. I didn't understand what was happening to me, why my stomach knotted whenever we were alone, why his voice seemed to echo differently in my ears now than it had just a few months ago. I brought the tea back into the living room, and Ron gave me that easy smile again as he took the cup from my hands. His fingers brushed mine, and a jolt shot up my arm like static electricity. I pulled away too quickly, nearly spilling the tea. "You okay?" he asked, his brows furrowing with concern. "Yeah," I said too fast. "Just tired. That's all." He didn't press, which was both a relief and a disappointment. We sipped our tea in silence, the hum of the TV filling the space between us. I tried to focus on the game, on anything but the warmth of his presence so close to mine. But as the evening wore on, I found myself wishing I could ask him to stay up a little longer, to keep the quiet at bay for just one more hour. The smell of something warm and sweet drifted into my room, nudging me awake. I blinked against the morning light spilling through the curtains, stretching lazily, as my mind fought to shake off the last tendrils of sleep. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, the faint aroma of pancakes. Then came a knock at the door. "Morning, kiddo." Ron's voice was soft, careful, like he wasn't sure if I'd still be asleep. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me. "Come in." He pushed the door open with his hip, a tray balanced in his hands. Pancakes, golden and fluffy, topped with fresh berries and a dollop of cream, sat on a plate alongside a steaming mug of coffee. He carried it over, placing it gently on my nightstand. "Thought you might like a proper breakfast," he said, grinning as he stepped back and stuffed his hands in his pockets. "I figured you could use a little spoiling." I stared at him, a warmth blooming in my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Ron, you didn't have to do this." He shrugged, as if it wasn't a big deal. "I wanted to." His words hung in the air, simple but heavy with something unspoken. I picked up the fork and took a bite, the sweetness of the syrup and tartness of the berries melting together on my tongue. They're perfect, I said, smiling up at him. Ron's shoulders relaxed, and he leaned against the doorframe, watching me eat. Good. I was worried I'd burn them. Your mom's always teasing me about my cooking skills, or lack thereof. I laughed softly, the sound lighter than I'd expected. You're better than you think. These could put diners to shame. He stayed, chatting idly about the weather and the errands he had planned for the day. It was normal, comforting, even, but there was a softness in his gaze that wasn't there before. I felt it like a pulse in the room, steady and undeniable. Thanks, Ron, I said as I set the empty tray back on the nightstand. For breakfast. For everything. He looked at me for a long moment, something flickering in his expression. Then he nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. Anytime, Amanda. He left the room. But the warmth of his presence lingered long after the door closed. The days passed, and something shifted between us. It wasn't just the little things, like the way he'd ruffle my hair when he walked by, or how I'd sit with him on the couch late into the evening. It was in the way we existed together in the house, as though the silence that used to stretch between us had softened into something else. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a box of old photos, Ron wandered into the living room and crouched beside me. What are you up to? Just going through some of Mom's things, I said, holding up a faded picture of her and Grandma. Thought I'd organize them before she comes back. You know how she hates clutter. He chuckled, leaning closer to look. I remember that dress. She wore it to one of our first dates. Danced circles around me all night. His voice was tinged with fondness, but when he turned to look at me, his expression was searching. She misses you, you know. Always talking about how proud she is of you. She doesn't say it enough. She doesn't have to. You're her world, Amanda. I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Thanks, Ron. He reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. The gesture was so simple, yet it sent a ripple through me that I didn't know how to explain. You're pretty incredible, you know that? The moment stretched, his hand lingering a second too long. I felt my heart quicken, a flush creeping up my neck. He seemed to realize it, too, and pulled back, clearing his throat. Anyway, he said, standing abruptly, I'll let you get back to it. But even as he walked away, I could feel the imprint of his touch like a brand. The first snow of the season came unexpectedly, blanketing the yard in white overnight. I woke to the sound of Ron outside, his laugh carrying through the still air as he struggled to coax the snowblower into cooperation. By the time I made it downstairs, he was brushing the snow off his jacket in the kitchen. You're up early. So are you, I said, grinning at the sight of him, his cheeks flushed from the cold. Did you win? Barely. That machine's older than me. He poured me a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. Figured you'd like something warm. I took a sip, savoring the heat. Thanks. Ron leaned against the counter, his gaze steady on me. How's the semester shaping up? It's fine, I said, shrugging. Busy, but it keeps my mind off things. Like what? Like Mom not being here. Like this house feeling too big for just us. His brow furrowed, a flicker of concern crossing his face. You know you can talk to me, right? About anything. I know. He reached across the counter, his hand covering mine. I mean it, Amanda. I looked down at his hand, at the way his fingers curled slightly around mine. I know, Ron. Thanks. But even as the words left my lips, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was lying. There were things I couldn't say to him, things I didn't even fully understand myself. And yet, his touch made me feel like I didn't have to say anything at all. Amanda, we could take a little vacation to the foot of the mountain if you don't mind. Just for a few days. You and me. Let's relax. I suggested. The next day we set off. The air was crisp with the scent of pine and earth as the trailer jostled gently along the winding mountain road. The further we drove, the more I felt the noise of the world fall away. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows over the trees, painting everything with a glow that felt almost magical. I glanced over at Ron, his hands steady on the wheel, his profile illuminated by the light filtering through the windshield. This was a good idea, I said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. He smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. I thought you could use a break. We both could. I nodded, watching as the road curved ahead, leading us deeper into the wilderness. It felt like we were leaving everything behind. Expectations, boundaries, the weight of the unspoken things between us. Out here, it was just us. When we arrived at the campsite, Ron said about unloading the supplies while I wandered toward the river. The water was clear, rushing over smooth stones, the sound soothing in its constancy. I knelt to dip my fingers into the icy flow, feeling a strange thrill at the touch of something so pure. You like it? Ron's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him standing a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. There was something different about the way he looked at me. An openness, a softness that made my breath catch. It's beautiful, I said, standing and brushing my hands against my jeans. So are you, he said. So quietly I almost didn't hear it. My heart skipped, the words hanging in the air between us like a secret. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, letting the sound of the river fill the silence. The first night by the river was cold but clear. The stars scattered across the sky like a glittering canopy. Ron built a fire, and we sat close, the warmth of the flames wrapping around us. He had brought a bottle of wine, and as we sipped, the conversation flowed easily, our laughter rising into the night like sparks. I don't think I've laughed this much in months, I admitted, leaning back on my hands and looking up at the sky. You've got a good laugh, Ron said, his voice soft. I've missed hearing it. I looked at him, my chest tightening at the way he was watching me. His eyes weren't just looking, they were seeing. I felt exposed, like he could see every part of me, even the parts one tried to keep hidden. You're different out here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. More, I don't know. Relaxed. He chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe it's because I'm with you. I felt my cheeks flush, and I looked away, the firelight dancing in my peripheral vision. You can't say things like that. Why not? He asked, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. It's true, because I struggled to find the words, my heart pounding. It's just complicated. Ron didn't say anything for a long moment, and when I finally looked at him, his expression was unreadable. But then he leaned back, his gaze never leaving mine. You're not a kid anymore, Amanda. You're a woman, and a damn incredible one at that. My breath hitched, his words hitting me like a wave. The world seemed to tilt, the firelight casting strange, flickering shadows between us. I didn't know who moved first, but suddenly we were closer. The space between us charged with something I couldn't name. Ron, I began, but his hand brushed mine, and the words died on my lips. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice low and steady. If you want me to stop, tell me now. I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I closed the remaining distance, my lips finding his in a kiss that was both tentative and electric. It was like nothing I had ever felt before, a rush of heat and emotion that left me breathless. When we finally pulled apart, his hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb brushing softly against my skin. Amanda, I know, I whispered, my voice trembling. I know. We sat there, the fire crackling softly, the river murmuring in the background. Neither of us spoke, but the air between us was alive with unspoken promises and uncharted emotions. The following day felt different. There was a lightness to our interactions, a new intimacy that hadn't been there before. As we hiked along the riverbank, Ron would reach for my hand without hesitation, his fingers threading through mine as though it were the most natural thing in the world. At one point, we stopped to rest on a large, flat rock overlooking the water. I sat with my knees drawn to my chest, watching the river rush past, while Ron leaned back on his hands, his eyes on me. You've changed, he said suddenly. I turned to him, startled. What do you mean? You're stronger than you were, more confident. It's beautiful to see. I felt my cheeks flush, and I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. I think you see more in me than there really is. No, he said, his voice firm. I see you, Amanda, the real you, and I can't help but admire you. The sincerity in his voice made my heart ache in the best way. I didn't know how to respond, so I reached out and took his hand. Holding it tightly in mine, he squeezed back, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. We sat there for a long time, the river singing softly below us, the mountains standing silent and eternal around us. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The firelight flickered against the walls of the trailer, casting warm shadows that danced in time with the low crackle of the logs outside. I sat cross-legged on the small makeshift bed, rubbing my shoulder absent-mindedly. The day's hike had been beautiful but exhausting, and the weight of the trail lingered in my muscles. "You're tense," Ron said, his voice soft but carrying an edge of concern. He stood in the narrow kitchenette, finishing the last of the dishes. "Want me to help with that?" I hesitated, my heart fluttering at the suggestion. "You don't have to." "I want to," he replied, drying his hands on a towel and crossing the small space to sit beside me. "Turn around." I did as he asked, my breath hitching as his hands rested lightly on my shoulders. The first touch was hesitant, as though he were testing the boundaries of what was okay, but as his fingers pressed into the tight knots beneath my skin, I couldn't help but relax into him, a quiet sigh escaping my lips. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Yes," I said, closing my eyes. "It feels good." His hands grew firmer, moving with purpose as he worked out the tension in my shoulders and neck. His touch was strong but careful, and every press of his fingers sent warmth coursing through me. I could feel the steadiness of his breathing behind me, the gentle rise and fall that seemed to sync with my own. "You carry so much here," he murmured, his thumbs circling the base of my neck. "Too much." I didn't know if he meant physically or emotionally, but either way, the words unraveled something inside me. I let my head fall forward, giving him better access, and his hands moved down my back, tracing the contours of my spine. It was intimate in a way I hadn't expected, his touch grounding and electric all at once. "Ron," I said softly, turning my head slightly toward him. He paused, his hands stilling for a moment. "What is it?" "I don't know how to explain this," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. "How this feels, how you make me feel." His hands slid to my upper arms, gently turning me to face him. The firelight caught in his eyes, and for a moment, the weight of everything we weren't saying hung heavy between us. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering against my cheek. "You don't have to explain," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I feel it too." And then he kissed me. It wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was full of the feelings we had been holding back, the ones we couldn't deny any longer. His lips were warm and soft, moving against mine with a tenderness that made my chest ache. I felt his hands cup my face, anchoring me to the moment as though afraid I might slip away. I leaned into him, my own hands finding their way to his shoulders, then his chest. The warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips sent a shiver through me, and I felt him pull me closer, his breath mingling with mine as the kiss deepened. When we finally parted, his forehead rested against mine, and we stayed like that for a long moment, our breaths mingling in the quiet of the trailer. "I've been trying to fight this," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But I can't anymore. I don't want to." I reached up, my fingers brushing the line of his jaw. "Me neither." The days that followed felt like a dream, the kind that blurs the line between reality and something more profound. Out in the mountains, far from the eyes of the world, we let the walls we'd built between us crumble. Every touch, every glance, every whispered word felt like a declaration of something neither of us could ignore any longer. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, we sat by the river, our feet dangling in the cool water. Ron reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, and I felt a swell of emotion so strong it nearly took my breath away. "I don't know where this will take us," he said, his eyes searching mine, "but I know I can't imagine my life without you in it." I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out," I said softly. "As long as we're together, We'll figure it out. His arm came around me, holding me close as the first stars began to appear in the sky. In that moment, with the river rushing beside us and the mountains standing silent and eternal around us, I felt a peace I had never known before. It wasn't the absence of fear or uncertainty. It was the presence of something stronger. Love. Not the kind of love that fit neatly into the roles society expected of us, but a love that was raw and real, born of shared moments and quiet truths. It was a love that defied the boundaries we'd tried to impose, one that demanded to be felt and lived, no matter the cost. And so, as the night deepened and the world seemed to fade away, we held each other close, knowing that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together.